Hello and welcome back to Political Debrief. I'm your host, Josh Oliverio. Climate change is a very real issue that you see all over the headlines and about how it's a problem that no one seems to figure out how to fix. Well, one person wrote a book about that and why, Dr. Elin Kelsey, the author of Hope Matters, Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical to Solving the Environmental Crisis, thinks we need to make more decisions around hope and be more positive when it comes to environmental action. She was very generous and gave us about 15 minutes of her time. I hope you enjoy our conversation now. And Elin Kelsey joins me now. Dr. Kelsey, thanks so much for joining Political Debrief today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for making this program.
So you are the author of this book right here, Hope Matters, Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical to Solving the Environmental Crisis. Not sure if that's backwards because of Zoom, but if it is, I will put a picture up on the screen. We'll get to that book in a minute, but do you just want to start with a quick 1-minute introduction of yourself?
Yeah, I'm a person who works I have a wonderful mix of things I do. I work as a scholar, so I have a number of research projects that I'm involved in around climate emotions more generally and hope specifically. And then I also am an author, and I also do a lot of engagement activities. So I'm working on a project right now with Panu Pikala, who is a Finnish climate emotions researcher who has created this phase model of eco-anxiety so that we can really understand sort of what's going on around that phenomenon that so many of us experience. And in order to make that information much more widely available, I'm working on a short animated film. So I'm writing that film. I'm working with an incredible Spotted Fawn, which is an Indigenous-led production company out of Vancouver, who's putting together the animation for it. And then I'm working with Queer Brown Vegan, who is a climate influencer, to think about how to share that more widely on social media, because we know people 25 years of age and younger are the largest demographic on Earth. It's 42% of people on Earth. And that demographic primarily gets their climate information online. So I'm an extremely lucky person. I get to do a lot of creative and thoughtful engagement around how it is that we understand what's happening on the planet and the emotional implications of that, and how those emotions influence our well-being and also our capacity to engage with these urgent issues.
So maybe we can start by setting the stage a little bit, because I know that a lot of young people know a lot about climate change, and often what they know is that climate change is bad and, you know, the earth is kind of done for, is what a lot of people think. How accurate would you say that idea is among young people?
I think you're really right that feeling of fatalistic doomism is really widespread. In fact, since climate emotions became sort of an active research area, we see more and more and more evidence that that's how people are feeling. And I think what's really challenging around all of this is that we know that our feelings are based on the very real issues that we face. There's no question about that. We have global urgent issues around climate change, around biodiversity loss, plastic pollution. These are all real, urgent, global scale problems. And at the same time, we also know that our feelings are influenced by how we hear about things. You know, that really creates our belief system. And so we know that media, which is the number one way we find out about what's going on around climate or any other issue, is very, very heavily oriented towards problem identification. So the most current statistic is less than 3% of all media that we hear about climate change even mentions a solution. So we end up with a skewed idea, really, that no one is doing anything. It's already too late. The problems are too big to be addressed. And so it's this mix of real urgent problems and a skew in terms of how often we hear about which things are changing. So just before I came on this call, for example, whenever I talk to groups, I have to update my information because things are really changing fast. So I just found out that 7 countries now are 100% powering their electricity by renewables. I think that's really interesting. And 40 countries, now half of their electricity production is by renewables. This is a massively important thing in order to get to that net zero shift where we see emissions, tipping in the right direction. And so staying up to date and knowing what is changing and which things are most impactful is a crucial aspect of being hopeful. And it's my interest in hope is evidence-based hope. That's why I'm using a current idea. That information just came out 2 days ago. So if we're not up to date, we really can take away this fatalistic doom feeling that not only are things wrecked, but they're going to stay wrecked, or they have no way to go except worse. And I think that's what all of my work is about, countering that aspect. And the more we counter and know what works, the more we can amplify what works. So in this sense, I think of hope as being extremely important political stance.
Yeah, definitely. We'll get to some of your solutions and your ideas in your book in a moment. But first, I just want to ask about how I'm going to call it climate doomism. I'm not sure if that's a good word. Let's talk about how that specifically affects young people. Are there additional ways that it impacts young people, or do you think it's just the medium or the way that we're receiving this information?
Yeah, I think it is the right term. Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist, coined it, and I think it's really true. We talk about climate denial as no longer the big issue. In fact, climate denial is that's not really a big issue anymore. The bigger issue is that we feel doomism, and I think doomism impacts many of us at any age. So in that sense, I don't think it's unique to any particular group. What I do think, though, is that these strong feelings of institutional betrayal, that we've come into a world that is incredibly marred by inequality. This is really a social justice issue, and I think that youth have been, well, in fact, I know from research, youth have been really the dominant driver in signposting that this underlying intersectionality of justice that underscores everything to do with climate. And so for youth, they have really influenced even the way that the Conference of the Parties talks about climate change, for example. Researchers have been able to follow and show that by youth signposting this as a justice issue, and then older people amplifying that too. So it's not nobody's contesting that, but it really did emerge as a social justice issue from the youth movement that has been so profoundly influential. If you look at the climate marches that happened in 2019, we now have 1 out of every 8 people on Earth lives in a place that has declared a climate emergency. And from my standpoint, that is an incredible outcome of these massive protests. And it's important that we know the outcomes that come out of those protests so that we, again, don't have this feeling that whatever we do doesn't matter at all.
So let's talk about your book a little bit now. You published it in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, if I'm not mistaken. I only was able to pick it up a couple days ago, so I haven't got through that much. But I want to talk about one of the chapters talking about hope being contagious. That's chapter 3 for those following along. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that chapter and what you mean by hope being contagious?
Yeah, it actually is. And I think that's really fascinating. So there's a lot of work in psychology around emotions and feelings and how they move around between us. And hope really is contagious, both face to face, or our emotions of any kind are contagious. So if we are sharing information online or face to face, we catch it from each other. So I think that's a really important idea to think about. So if I come on here and I am feeling heavily depleted and I really can't see anything forward, there's a very good chance that you're going to feel that, and that's going to influence how you feel. And again, I think because we're in this landscape of where both our media orientation towards climate change is in this problem identification frame, and it's not that knowing about problems isn't wrong. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is the heavy orientation without also focusing on which things are moving in the right directions is the problem. And unfortunately, we have the same issue with the way we learn about climate change in school and at university. So we've got this almost, I would say, a system that we unintentionally created that creates the wild spread of despair. We just keep reinforcing how broken things are. And when we do that, we spread that feeling to one another. And I think it really almost comes from, we almost show that we care about something or that we're intelligent about something by, chronicling how broken it is. And that is understandable because they're such worrisome issues. But when we also chronicle the things that move in the right directions, it changes our feelings and we can spread that as well. And that's very empowering. And that gives us a sense of agency. And that's what we need to deal with these really crucial issues.
One thing that I actually really found beneficial from your presentation that I attended a couple of weeks back was you had a slide with a list of kind of some of the climate successes that we've had recently. I might be putting you on the spot a little bit here, but do you want to just share some of those successes with us?
I mean, I think it's really interesting where we're moving with energy. You know, we really are seeing that happening at a global level, and that renewable energy piece is so critical to our emissions. So when you follow that, it gets very exciting because those graphs are moving faster than people predicted they would. And we see it happening at all different scales. You know, we see it changing in shipping. And for me, that's exciting because I'm really interested in oceans. And one of the big issues of oceans is ocean noise pollution, you know, and as ships become more electric, they become quieter. And we know during the pandemic, I did a series during the pandemic on the anthropause, which was this time of human quieting, you know, that happened during the lockdowns. And we saw extraordinary responses from marine animals all over the world. So quieter oceans are a good thing. So when I see that number changing, I'm not only thinking about emissions, I'm thinking about its impact on other species from a biodiversity standpoint. And we know nature-based solutions, which bring together biodiversity concerns with climate change concerns, are a win-win, you know? So I think it's just really following where those things move. We see a large rise now in the number of countries committing to protect 30% of land and ocean by the year 2030. That's a big goal. And we see a lot of active movement in that. And again, that's really a positive thing from this nature-based solutions orientation. So those are just a couple. There's now an international agreement being formed around plastic pollution. This is an issue many of us care deeply about and can feel overwhelmed by. So knowing that plastic bag bans have had really positive impacts all over the world and we need more of it, so knowing which things work and in what context they work, what makes a plastic bag ban or tariff or whatever most effective when you know more about that. And that's why I think solutions journalism, which is this whole field of journalism that focuses on not only what's broken, but rigorously reporting on which things are moving in the right directions and in what ways, that enables us to be far more efficient in the ways we respond.
What about, and you're talking about solutions journalism, which I think is a really interesting element, but as you know, this is a political podcast. So what about solutions-driven policy in terms of creating climate policies that encourage hope and are based on solutions? Right now, I know we both live in Canada, and right now it feels like the only solution being debated federally is a very divisive tax on carbon. What do you think is the approach to creating policies and climate laws or whatever that are more solutions driven?
Yeah, I think it's really almost false to all of us to think in diverse ways. So when you say it's the only thing, I think, I don't quite feel that way. Like, I'm also looking at what's going on with transit across Canada, what's going on with transit around the world. We know the rise of transit is huge. And it's really a social justice issue because I should have a right to be able to get around without having to own a car, just as you should. And it's a huge issue in terms of emissions, in terms of health, in terms of how we use urban spaces so that we can create wildlife corridors within cities, all of those kind of things. So to my mind, there's lots of climate issues going on in a policy frame at all times. And I think we can fall into this trap almost of thinking this is the only issue. So I like to look at many scales. I look at the scales of cities, and it turns out that mayors are very involved from a climate change perspective. What's going on at the city level matters. And given that we live on an urban planet, I think that's a pretty powerful thing. So I try to look at, what's going on with food policies. So Canada Food Guide came out a few years ago in a policy way around plant-based eating. We know that plant-based eating is now the number one trend in food around the world. And it's the number one thing that Project Drawdown tells us, which is a large data aggregator around the most efficient and effective things we can do for climate change, puts plant-based eating at number one. So I think what I'm trying to say is there's lots of stuff going on around climate, and we can get I think, too focused in one thing. Not that that thing doesn't matter, but it's really powerful to look at many things and see where things are moving and keep moving those ones that are moving forward and really bring insight to those ones that are stuck.
All right, my last question for you today. If there's a young person that wants to get involved, but they're not feeling hopeful or they don't know where to start, what's your advice for them?
Yeah, I'd say first off, to really accept and appreciate yourself that you really do care about this thing. That's why you can feel really lost and not hopeful. It's a sign that you have a deep care for the state of the planet. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I feel badly when people feel like that. And I really understand why we feel like that. We all do sometimes. We have many emotions and we should welcome all of our emotions. So that's the first thing. Welcome however you feel. And then secondly, I'd say choose something that you really care about and how you like to do it. So who you like to be with. So whether you like to act through music or art or sports or your faith, whatever way fills you up collectively, there's climate engagement through that identity. And I'd really say act from the identities that fill you up, because that's where you get communities of belonging. That's where you feel empowered. And just as I was saying about diversity, there's every way to make an impact on climate. It doesn't have to be in some place, in some way that doesn't feel comfortable.
All right, Elin Kelsey, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.